Adding chickens to our garden was one of the best decisions we made. It took growing our own food to a whole new level, and I'm really pleased that we did it. The decision to get chickens was based on three things. The first, we wanted to have access to eggs that were absolutely fresh and not from a supermarket. We wanted to make sure that our eggs came from a source that we knew were being looked after and the welfare of the chickens was being maintained. Secondly, I wanted to create an ecosystem within my garden and allotment where I'm taking from the soil but also putting back, and chickens are wonderful for taking scraps and turning that into manure that you can later on use for fertility in your garden. And finally, we wanted a little bit of company in the garden. It's amazing what a little bit of life and movement does to a garden. It brings it all to life. We had a slight period where we didn't have a chicken flock, and it was horrible. We really missed seeing the chickens pottering around and enjoying themselves. And they provide a huge amount of company to me when I'm out in the garden, and they're never far behind me when I'm digging. We got our first flock back in 2000, and we got them from a bantam breeder. Unfortunately, they've closed down now, but it was a really nice setup with loads and loads of different breeds you could get. And we've not gone back since. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of attacks from foxes, which is the main predator around here, which meant the first flock we had unfortunately didn't make it, and they were lost after about a year or so. We did get a new flock, and again we were hit by another fox attack, and since then I've really upped my game when it comes to predator proofing. But keeping chickens has been something that I've constantly wanted to make sure that we're doing despite those setbacks. And each setback, I hope that I've got a little bit better at looking after my chickens. There are a few things that I know now that I didn't when I got my first flock, and I wanted to share them with you so you don't get yourselves into any trouble going forward, even though that's highly unlikely. But it's definitely worth knowing a few things before you start down this journey. Before investing a reasonable amount of money to start off a flock, it's worth knowing whether or not you can actually home them. If you live in the countryside and you've got a big piece of land like a small holding, chances are it's absolutely fine for you to do that. But the more urban you go, the more rules you're going to come across and the more things that you're going to have to consider in keeping that flock. As I'm speaking today, it is 2024 and I am in the UK, so these rules do apply to my situation. So there may be different rules where you are. One of the first things to consider is where you're going to keep them. In the UK, you can have allotments, and obviously you've got your own garden as well. And some allotments will allow you to keep chickens. For example, mine is a council allotment, and the council rules do allow me to keep chickens for my own consumption, whether it be egg or meat, but I do need to let them know that I intend to do that. Now, it's not something I want to do on my allotment, but I know people who do that, and I'm hoping to take you along in the future to someone who is keeping their chickens on their allotment to give you some of their perspectives. In most cases, you'll be looking to keep these chickens at home, and there you have two situations. One, you're a tenant, or you have a freehold property. If you're a tenant, you do need to make sure that your leasing arrangements allows you to keep pets and animals. Now, in the past, when I've had rental properties, I have actually spoken to the landlord, and they've been more than accommodating to what I've been asking for, but they could say no, and unfortunately you would have to respect that. So if you're thinking about keeping chickens and you are renting, it's definitely worth thinking about this before renting a property. If you're a freeholder, you'll have some deeds. Now, those deeds will stipulate what you can and can't do, and they are called restrictive covenants. Now, some places will say things like you're not allowed to keep poultry or other livestock on there, but a lot of that is more about trying to prevent it causing a nuisance to others. It's worth noting that any dispute around deeds and restrictive covenants is actually a civil matter, so it does require somebody taking you to court over it. So if your deeds restrictive covenants do say that you can't have poultry, but you still intend to place them on your property, it is definitely worth making sure that your neighbours are all on side so that you don't come across any problems. Even if it's perfectly fine to do any of this, you do need to consider the potential for nuisance, and there are nuisance rules in most councils. So if they become too noisy, too smelly, somebody could complain and the council could come round and serve notice on what you're doing. So Again, it's definitely worth considering all of your neighbours and working with them and thinking about where you're placing them, how you're looking after your chickens to avoid them becoming nuisances. Now, my chickens produce quite a lot of eggs, so I do make sure that my neighbours have access to those eggs, and I've sited my chicken run in the far corner of my garden away from my neighbours.
So I'm just going to introduce you to one of the chickens. This is one of 4 that we have in our flock at the moment. She is, if I can get her in the right place, a Rhode Island Red mixed with a West Sussex. And they're brilliant, brilliant layers.
If you do have over 50 birds, you do need to make sure that they are registered with the Animal and Plant Health Agency. And they will register them and keep you up to date on any illnesses in the area and any controls that you need to take into account. And particularly if there are any problems with your flock, you will need to inform them of them. If you have a flock that's less than 50, as most of us probably will, you're not forced to register them, but it is advisable. I've registered my flock, and I did that when there was a big outbreak of bird flu in the area. That way they know where the flocks are, but also I'm getting regular messages from them letting me know what conditions are and what illnesses are circulating at the moment. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs sets out a number of guidelines around how animals should be kept and what welfare standards you should be looking for. I'll put a link in the notes below so that you can go there and have a look yourself, but in principle they are just good standard rules to be following, and they're around making sure they've got access to water and food and making sure that they are disease free as well. So there's definitely some rules that you need to be looking at from a government perspective to make sure that you're on the right side and doing the right thing for your animals. The biggest issues I wasn't aware of before getting my first flock was bird flu and the rules that surrounded it. Now, they don't come into force every single year and sometimes for part of the year only, but there are rules that come into force that you must follow with your flock. One of the key rules is around making sure that they are separated from wild birds to stop the transmission of bird flu. The reason this was impactful was that I wasn't prepared for it when it came round, and in around about December 2000 I needed to make sure that I was following those rules, and that meant I needed to purchase netting, as you can see behind me. You also need to make sure that the food and water is covered so that it doesn't get contaminated by droppings from wild birds. So in summary, if you're thinking about getting a flock, make sure that you've considered all of the rules around keeping them. Look at your deeds and your tenancy arrangements for your home or for your allotment to make sure there isn't anything that's stopping you from doing it. And even if you can go ahead, make sure you consider your neighbours. There can be noise and smell that could be deemed a nuisance, and you don't want to be getting complaints made about you. There are also laws around the size of flock and whether you need to register them or not. If you've got 50 or more, make sure you register them. If not, do consider registering them so you can get all of the alerts around any temporary control zones in your area. And finally, make sure you're prepared for any laws coming into force around bird flu, so you don't, one, get your animals in a situation where they get bird flu, but also that you don't get into any trouble yourself. That's some information that would have been really helpful for me before I started with my flock, and I've learned along the way. If you've got any rules and regulations that you think is worth sharing with people, please drop it down in the comments, and that will really help me out and others as well. In the next video, we'll be going over some of the things you need to prepare before your flock comes home, and I look forward to seeing you on that. I'll see you next time.